When discussing World War II, it's common to picture the beaches of Normandy, the bombings of Berlin, or the atomic devastation of Hiroshima. However, one of the most devastating stories of this global conflict remains largely ignored, that of China, a nation that endured immense suffering and recorded approximately 19.5 million deaths during those years. China was one of the countries most affected by the conflict, not only due to the direct confrontation with Japan, but also because of the complex internal dynamics that shaped its resistance. Hostility with Japan reached unprecedented levels of cruelty, while political disputes within China itself aggravated the difficulties in dealing with occupation and war. This story, often relegated to the background, is essential to understanding the magnitude and real impact of World War II. The beginning of Japanese expansion, the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. In the 1930s, the balance of power in Asia began to change dramatically. Japan, a rapidly modernizing nation with growing expansionist ambitions, turned its attention to Manchuria, a strategic region in northeastern China. Rich in natural resources and located in a key position, Manchuria became the first target in Japan's plans to establish itself as the dominant power in Asia. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, China found itself in a state of structural weakness. Decades of political instability and infighting between internal factions had fragmented the country. The civil war between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong, which broke out in 1927, worsened this vulnerability. The country, mired in internal divisions, presented an ideal opportunity for Japan to advance its strategic objectives. With its expanding economy, Japan saw in Manchuria a solution to many of its problems. The region's resources, such as coal, iron, and timber, promised to satisfy Japan's industrial needs, while its low population density provided land for colonization and agricultural expansion. Furthermore, controlling Manchuria would offer a geopolitical advantage by strengthening Japan's position against potential rivals in Asia. In September 1931, the pivotal moment arrived with the Mukden incident. A section of the South Manchuria Railway, operated by Japan, was bombed, and the explosion was presented as an attack by Chinese forces. However, it was actually a covert operation carried out by the Kwantung Army, Japan's military force stationed in the region. This carefully planned incident provided the necessary pretext to justify a military invasion. Japanese troops responded quickly and efficiently. Within days, they had occupied key Manchurian cities, facing scattered and poorly equipped resistance. By the end of 1931, Japan had consolidated its control over the region. In 1932, Japan established the puppet state of Manchukuo, nominally ruled by Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. However, the new regime was merely a facade to legitimize the Japanese occupation. The invasion of Manchuria marked a significant shift in international relations of the time. The League of Nations condemned the action and refused to recognize Manchukuo as a legitimate state, but the measures taken against Japan were ineffective. In response to this, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933, sending a clear message about its willingness to act unilaterally to achieve its objectives. This event was more than just a territorial annexation. It laid the groundwork for an imperialist strategy that would extend in the years to come. Japan used Manchuria as a base to consolidate its military and economic power, while continuing its expansion into other parts of China. In the process, it challenged the international system of the time, exposing the inability of the world powers to curb the advance of a nation determined to reshape the map of Asia. The occupation of Manchuria was also a devastating blow to China. Not only did it lose a key region, but Japanese aggression further exacerbated internal divisions, making any attempt at unity against the common enemy more difficult. The nationalists and communists continued to clash, while the country suffered from the impact of foreign occupation. Although often overshadowed by events that unfolded in Europe a few years later, the Manchuria episode clearly marked a prelude to the global conflicts that were to come. It served as an early reminder of how the ambition of one nation could destabilize entire regions and challenge the established order. In this sense, Manchuria was not only the site of an invasion, but also the first act in a conflict that would change the course of world history. The Marco Polo Bridge incident and the beginning of systematic occupation. On July 7, 1937, near Beijing, a seemingly minor confrontation between Japanese and Chinese troops became the trigger for a large-scale offensive that would change the course of China. Known as the Marco Polo Bridge incident, this event marked the beginning of the systematic occupation of northern China by the Imperial Japanese Army, consolidating Japan's expansionist ambitions in Asia. It all began with a report of a missing Japanese soldier during military maneuvers near the bridge, a crucial strategic point connecting Beijing with other important regions of China. Japanese troops demanded permission to search a village for the soldier, but the local Chinese forces controlling the area refused. The refusal led to an exchange of gunfire that quickly escalated into an armed confrontation. Hours later, the soldier reappeared unharmed, raising doubts about whether the incident had been deliberately fabricated as a pretext to justify military intervention. The Marco Polo Bridge, in addition to its strategic value, represented a symbol of Chinese control over the northern part of the country. Japan's military response, which quickly mobilized reinforcements to the region, revealed a premeditated plan to exploit any excuse to extend its territorial dominance. What began as a limited dispute transformed into a methodical offensive, with the Imperial Army securing key positions in Beijing and its surroundings in the days following the incident. The speed and decisiveness of the Japanese advance highlighted the logistical and technological superiority of their forces over the Chinese, who were facing internal divisions and equipment shortages. The Japanese strategy focused on capturing transportation routes, such as railways and roads that connected the country's main regions. This not only fragmented China's ability to respond, but also allowed Japan to consolidate its military presence at strategic points with relative ease. The incident marked the turning point between years of diplomatic tensions and open conflict. Beijing, as the historical capital, was one of the first cities to fall under Japanese control. However, the occupation was not limited to the capture of cities. It was a systematic effort to dismantle China's political and military structure from its foundations, ensuring control over areas that would facilitate further advance into the interior of the country. The Marco Polo Bridge incident, although initially local, was the prelude to a wider conflict. It represented the culmination of accumulated tensions between the two countries and Japan's shift toward an aggressive expansionist strategy that would define the following years. This event, full of symbolism and practical consequences, marked the beginning of an occupation that would deeply alter the history of the region. The Nanjing massacre, the unspeakable horror. In December 1937, after the Japanese victory in the Battle of Shanghai, the Imperial Japanese Army turned its attention to Nanjing, then the capital of China. The city, which held significant strategic and symbolic value, was quickly surrounded and subjected to a siege that culminated on December 13th with its capture. What followed was one of the darkest episodes of World War II, the Nanjing massacre, a 6-week period of killings, torture, and rapes that resulted in between 200,000 and 300,000 deaths. The Japanese advance toward Nanjing was relentless. The Chinese forces, decimated and disorganized after their defeat in Shanghai, offered minimal resistance. Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Kuomintang, had relocated the government to Chongqing, leaving the city virtually without leadership. The remaining troops, many of whom were newly recruited and inadequately trained, lacked coordination and morale. When the Japanese issued their ultimatum on December 9th, demanding surrender within 24 hours, the Chinese authorities did not respond, sealing the city's fate. On December 10th, the Japanese assault began. With overwhelming superiority in logistics and weaponry, the Japanese forces broke through the defenses within a few days. When Nanjing fell on December 13th, what followed was not a typical occupation, but complete devastation. Japanese soldiers, without effective supervision from their commanders, unleashed a wave of indiscriminate violence against both captured soldiers and civilians. With the fall of the city, executions of prisoners of war began immediately. Thousands of Chinese soldiers, many unarmed or disguised as civilians, were rounded up and executed without trial. The killings were carried out in mass and systematic ways. Some prisoners were shot, others stabbed with bayonets, and many were beheaded. A particularly macabre act was the competition among Japanese officers to see how many prisoners they could decapitate in a set amount of time. These competitions were even documented in Japanese newspapers of the time as if they were a sport. The executions were not limited to soldiers. Any man who appeared to be a combatant or simply had the misfortune of being found was murdered. The bodies of the victims were thrown into the Yangtze River or buried in mass graves. In places like Mufu Mountain, it is estimated that up to 57,000 prisoners were executed in just a few days. These massacres were not driven by any military logic, but by a desire for absolute extermination. The civilians of Nanjing suffered the same brutal fate as the captured soldiers. Men, women, children, and the elderly were killed indiscriminately. It is estimated that tens of thousands of civilians died during these weeks, victims of summary executions, indiscriminate bombings, and acts of sadism. One of the most shocking features of the massacre was the sexual violence. During the 6 weeks of occupation, between 20,000 and 80,000 women were raped by Japanese soldiers. The victims included girls as young as 8 and elderly women. Many of them were murdered afterward to prevent them from telling what had happened. Some were attacked in front of their families, who were also executed after witnessing the abuse. It was not only women who were victims of these assaults. Small children and young men were also subjected to sexual violence, reflecting the total dehumanization that prevailed among the Japanese troops. The lack of supervision from military commanders allowed these crimes to be carried out with complete impunity. The testimonies of the few foreigners present in the city, such as John Rabe, describe a situation where human life had lost all value. In addition to the killings and abuses, the Japanese troops systematically looted Nanjing. Homes, businesses, and government buildings were stripped of their goods. What could not be taken was destroyed. Many parts of the city were set on fire, reducing entire neighborhoods to ashes. Temples, schools, and hospitals were not spared, and those who sought refuge in them were similarly attacked. The key infrastructures of the city, such as bridges and roads, were rendered unusable. What had once been a vibrant capital became a place of absolute desolation. The Yangtze River, which had once represented a source of life for the region, became an improvised cemetery, with corpses floating in its waters. The massacre left deep scars on the survivors. Families were destroyed, and the few who managed to escape with their lives were left physically and psychologically marked. Accounts from foreign witnesses, including diplomats and missionaries, documented the atrocities, although many of these stories were not widely known until after the war. John Rabe, a German businessman and member of the Nazi Party, established a safety zone in Nanjing that saved thousands of lives. His diaries detail the horrors he witnessed and served as crucial evidence in post-war trials. However, even in the protected zone, Japanese soldiers conducted raids to take people and execute them. Biological experiments and Japanese atrocities, science at the service of barbarism. During the Japanese occupation of China, the atrocities committed by the Imperial Army were not limited to mass executions or systematic rapes. In parallel, biological and chemical experiments were carried out using humans as subjects for inhumane testing, driven by the quest for weapons that could change the course of the war. These acts were primarily carried out by the infamous Unit 731, a secret organization dedicated to biological and chemical warfare research, led by military Dr. Shiro Ishii. Unit 731, officially named the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, operated mainly in Harbin in the Manchuria region. Founded in the early 1930s, its official purpose was to research diseases and develop methods to protect Japanese troops. However, in secret, it became a center for human experimentation that employed atrocious methods to test biological and chemical weapons. It is estimated that between 3,000 and 12,000 people were used as test subjects in the laboratories of Unit 731 and its affiliated facilities. The prisoners were mostly Chinese, but also included Koreans, Mongols, Russians, and even some Allied prisoners. These victims, dehumanized by their captors, were referred to by the euphemism marutas, or logs, to erase any reference to their humanity. The experiments conducted in Unit 731 and other affiliated centers surpassed any standard of cruelty known at the time. The practices included prisoners were subjected to surgical operations without anesthesia to study how the human body responded to different traumas. Limbs were amputated to observe the development of infections, and in some cases these limbs were reattached to different parts of the body. Other experiments included the removal of internal organs while the victims were conscious, with the purpose of understanding how certain diseases affected vital organs. Scientists infected the prisoners with deadly pathogens such as bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid fever, and anthrax. They then observed the progress of the diseases without providing treatment, documenting the symptoms until the subjects died. Occasionally, prisoners were intentionally infected with multiple diseases to analyze the interactions between different pathogens. To study human resistance to extreme cold, prisoners were exposed to sub-zero temperatures, freezing their limbs until they developed gangrene. Often, researchers attempted to revive the frozen limbs by submerging them in hot water or repeatedly striking them to restore blood flow. These experiments were intended to help the Imperial Army understand how to treat soldiers exposed to extreme climates. Unit 731 developed biological weapons meant to be used on the battlefield. Among the deadliest were bombs filled with fleas infected with the bubonic plague, designed to release disease-carrying insects in populated areas. These bombs were tested on cities and villages in China, causing devastating epidemics. Chemical bombs that dispersed toxic gases or defoliants to destroy crops were also tested, with the aim of provoking massive famines among the enemy population. Prisoners were subjected to extreme conditions of food, water, and sleep deprivation to analyze the limits of human endurance. Torture tests were also carried out to study how humans responded to extreme pain and psychological pressure. The biological weapons developed in Unit 731 were not limited to the laboratories. They were used in direct attacks on the Chinese civilian population, turning the country into a large-scale testing ground. In one of the most well-known operations, Japanese planes dropped bombs containing fleas infected with the bubonic plague on villages in Zhejiang and Changde. These artificially spread epidemics caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, demonstrating the destructive potential of these weapons. With Japan's imminent defeat at the end of World War II in 1945, Shiro Ishii ordered the complete destruction of Unit 731's facilities and the execution of the surviving prisoners to eliminate any evidence of the atrocities committed. The complexes were set on fire, and documents related to the research were buried or destroyed. However, they could not erase all traces. Testimonies from former employees, recovered documents, and human remains found at the experiment sites revealed the scale of the crimes. Chinese resistance and international alliances. China's resistance to the Japanese invasion marked a crucial moment in World War II, as its ability to keep the conflict alive had a significant impact on Axis strategy. Under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist forces retreated to the mountainous interior of China, while the communists, led by Mao Zedong, resisted from their base in Yan'an in the northwest of the country. Despite enormous difficulties, China's determination not to surrender played a key role in shaping international events. When Japan captured Shanghai and Nanjing, it seemed that Chinese resistance was doomed to fail. Chiang Kai-shek's retreat to Chongqing left the Kuomintang government far from the front lines, but it ensured the continuity of China's administrative and military state. From their position in the interior, the Kuomintang organized the defense, while the Chinese Communist Party, using guerrilla tactics, harassed Japanese forces in occupied regions. Although the rivalry between the communists and nationalists remained, the common threat posed by Japan temporarily unified their efforts. This combined resistance not only slowed Japan's advance, but also prevented Japan from consolidating full control over China. In the early years of the conflict, the war between China and Japan remained relatively isolated from the global stage. Although the Soviet Union provided limited assistance to China, including armaments and military training, the Western powers stayed on the sidelines, focusing on the growing tensions in Europe. The United States and Great Britain expressed sympathy for the Chinese cause, but did not offer direct military support. However, the Sino-Japanese conflict laid the groundwork for a broader confrontation in Asia, which would eventually involve the world powers. Had China surrendered in 1938, Japan would have secured a strategic position without opposition, allowing for rapid expansion into Southeast Asia, British India, or even a more aggressive attack on the Soviet Union. Chinese resistance not only challenged this scenario, but also forced Japan to expend significant resources on a prolonged conflict, weakening its ability to operate on other fronts. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, marked a turning point for both China and the rest of the world. In an effort to neutralize the US Pacific Fleet, Japan carried out a devastating attack that destroyed much of the United States naval power in 2000, the region, killing 2,438 people and wounding 1,178. Although initially successful, this attack united the United States in its decision to enter the war. With the United States formally involved, the conflict in Asia was no longer a regional confrontation. Japan now faced an enemy with incomparable industrial resources, capable of replenishing its military strength at a pace that Tokyo could not match. This strategic shift directly benefited China, which became a key ally in the Allied war effort. The entry of the United States into the war strengthened China's position. Under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's leadership, the US sought to make China a cornerstone of the Allied effort in Asia. While direct military support on the ground was limited, the US provided essential resources, including armaments, supplies, and strategic advice. One of the most symbolic gestures of this alliance was the Cairo Conference in November 1943, where Chiang Kai-shek joined Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to discuss the Allied strategy in Asia. This event positioned China as one of the Big Four allies, along with the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, solidifying its role in the emerging world order. US support also included the creation of the Flying Tigers, a group of American pilots who fought in China before the official entry of the United States into the war. These aviators helped protect supply routes and attacked Japanese targets, providing some relief to Chinese forces. However, this support was not without limitations. While China bore the brunt of the Japanese occupation, Allied resources were primarily concentrated in Europe and the Pacific. This left China struggling with insufficient resources and forced to continue resisting a formidable enemy that, though weakened, was still powerful. Chinese resistance forced Japan to fight on multiple fronts, dividing its resources and weakening its ability to sustain a prolonged war. Between 1942 and 1943, the Japanese High Command reduced its offensive operations in China to focus on its conflict with the United States in the Pacific. This allowed China to consolidate its defensive position and continue harassing Japanese forces. In the end, Chinese resistance was a decisive factor in Japan's defeat. While the Western powers played a crucial role in the Pacific theater, China's persistence ensured that Japan could never stabilize its control over continental Asia. Moreover, China's role in World War II laid the foundation for its status as one of the victorious powers, consolidating its position in the New World Order. The end of the war and Japan's surrender. In August 1945, after nearly a decade of conflict in Asia and 4 years of total war in the Pacific, Japan faced a desperate situation. Germany's defeat in May of that year left Japan as the last remaining Axis power still fighting, while the Allied forces intensified their military pressure on multiple fronts. The events of that summer culminated in Japan's surrender, bringing an end to one of the most devastating chapters in modern history. On August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union fulfilled its promise to intervene against Japan after Germany's defeat. In a large-scale military operation, the Red Army invaded Manchuria, where the Kwantung Army, Japan's main force in mainland Asia, had been stationed to defend the interests of the empire. The Soviet offensive, which included coordinated attacks from Mongolia and eastern Siberia, was devastating. With superior weaponry and a carefully planned strategy, the Soviets advanced quickly, destroying defensive lines and capturing vast stretches of territory within days. The collapse of the Kwantung Army not only deprived Japan of its stronghold on the Asian continent, but also demoralized the Japanese High Command, which now faced the total loss of its ability to maintain occupation in Manchuria and Korea. While Japan struggled with the Soviet advance in Manchuria, it suffered an even more devastating blow. On August 6, 1945, an American bomber dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, instantly killing tens of thousands of people and destroying much of the city. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, causing similar destruction. Although Japan was already in an extremely vulnerable position, these attacks represented a new dimension of destruction that made it clear the war could no longer continue. The atomic bombs not only annihilated entire cities, but also highlighted Japan's inability to resist in the face of the Allies' industrial and military power. With the Red Army advancing rapidly in Manchuria and the threat of more atomic bombings, Emperor Hirohito made a decision that would change the course of Japanese history. Despite initial resistance within the military high command, Hirohito intervened directly to approve unconditional surrender. In a radio message to the nation on August 15, 1945, the emperor announced that Japan would surrender, marking the first time that most Japanese citizens had heard his voice. The announcement brought an end to a war that had devastated Japan and much of Asia. On September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, Japanese government representatives officially signed the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri, with delegates from the Allies, including the United States, Great Britain, China, and the Soviet Union present. In mainland Asia, Japan's surrender had an immediate impact. Over 1 million Japanese soldiers stationed in China surrendered to the Kuomintang government. This event not only marked the end of the Japanese occupation in China, but also the beginning of a complex process of political and social transition. The surrendered soldiers were repatriated to Japan in the following years, while China attempted to rebuild its nation after years of devastation. The final battles of the conflict took place in the provinces of Hunan and Guangxi, where Japanese troops tried to resist in their last positions before receiving the surrender order. However, by then, Japanese resistance was symbolic, and the mass surrender marked the end of the war in Asia. With Japan's surrender, World War II officially ended, but the aftermath of the conflict continued to resonate for decades. In China, the war left millions dead, a shattered economy, and deep political divisions between the Kuomintang and the Communists, who would soon face off in a civil war. In Japan, the surrender marked the end of the imperial militarist period and the beginning of an occupation led by the United States, which sought to reform Japanese society and ensure that it would never again pose a threat to world peace. The devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with the horrors of the war, left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the world. World War II irrevocably transformed China and defined its role on the global stage. As one of the first victims of Japanese expansionism, China endured enormous human and material losses, but its resistance was crucial in the defeat of Japan. By keeping the Japanese army occupied for years, China weakened its ability to concentrate forces on other fronts, thereby facilitating the Allied strategy in the Pacific. The war deeply altered China's political landscape. The temporary cooperation between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party against Japan did not prevent the conflict from exacerbating their differences. The victory over Japan was not enough to unify the country, and the divisions culminated in the eventual communist victory in 1949, establishing a new political order. On the international stage, China's participation as one of the Allies solidified its global position. The war granted it a place among the victorious powers and a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, reflecting its strategic importance. In recent years, China has acknowledged the sacrifice of all those who participated in the resistance, both communists and nationalists. This recognition marks an effort to reconcile its history and honor those who fought for national independence. World War II not only redefined China, but also highlighted its capacity to resist and overcome historical adversities.